Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
When we received orders to return to the Houston by way of the clipper ship, we went down to the landing in Pearl Harbor at night. I remember the purser was there with his list of people and checking things off. It was a big airplane, and there was like a light over a pool table lighting up his efforts. And alongside him was a Army colonel, nattily dressed. His pants were creased perfectly. He just real fine-looking example of Army officers. He too was going back to the combat zone, or for the first time maybe, and he was waiting to join the passengers on the clipper ship. And at that point, the purser, knocking off these names, he turns to the colonel in my presence and says, "Colonel, I'm sorry, but these people have higher priorities than you. We can't take you aboard. Here's a colonel, we're enlisted men, and you should have seen the condition of us. We didn't have razors or anything. We needed a shave, we needed clothing. All we had was the clothes we left the ship with." Well, I foolishly made the statement to the colonel. I said, "Colonel, if you have any real drag, hope you can use it now. You can have my place. I don't want to go back." But he didn't appreciate that at all. But anyway, I thought that, in retrospect, I think that's humorous. That
his level of rank, and
yeah.
your priority was greater than his.
And especially our appearance. So we got back. The clipper ship flew us.
And when you say the clipper ship, that was an airplane that was designed to take off from the water.
Oh
was
yeah,
it not?
yeah. And it was the biggest ship I had ever seen to date. And I remember the takeoff in Honolulu Harbor. As I say, it was at night, dark, and all I could see these blue lights flashing by, and it felt like there was a 10-mile takeoff run. Boom, 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 boom. You know, it was a hollow metal hull, and it was pretty noisy, banging into the waves or the ripples, whatever. But we finally got into the air, and we flew the.
George, did you look at that with great excitement, or were you
of course,
nervous?
I had never been on an airplane before. Little did I realize at the time that some years later I'd wind up a 4,000-hour pilot. But maybe that encouraged it, I don't know. But anyway, this airplane flew us, had several stops. I know it stopped at Johnson Island and Kwajalein, and eventually we wound up in Guam. And there we transferred, well, the following day we had to transfer to a DC-3 to make the rest of the flight into Ulithi. And that was interesting too, because it was my only experience ever, and I'm glad it was the only experience I ever had with people firing at you with small arms. We were stationed for the evening in tents alongside a Marine operation, U.S. Marines.
And what island was this on, George?
Guam.
Guam.
And the mess hall was a bombed-out hospital. In fact, it had more holes in the roof than it had roof from the bombings. And I watched these Marines in line for chow, and they had these mess kits or whatever those people in infantry use, and they were dipping them into this chemical or something, and then they were all slopping their, and the food looked terrible to begin with. And as hungry as I was, I could not, I didn't even bother to eat. So there was an older fellow there in Navy work clothes, introduced himself. He was a CB. And he says, "We have a base just, I don't know, 2 miles from here, something like that.
And when you say a CB?
Construction battalion, which were people who used to construct air bases and all kinds of fortifications.
Assigned to the Navy, were they?
Oh yeah, they were part of the Navy. They were CB battalion is what they called them. And most of them were older men, and they were men who were carpenters, plumbers, and what have you. So this fellow was a nice guy. He invited us. I think there were 4 or 5 of us, the 3 radio men, including myself and a couple other fellas. He said, we're only a couple of miles down the road, and want to come down there and have chow? Hey, sure looks better than what these Marines were eating. So we agreed to go, and he drove us down, and we even had a glass of beer. It was at whatever beer they call it, 3-point beer or something like that, which was good. We had a nice meal. Then it came time to go back where we were going to stay overnight. And we're walking along the road, and all of a sudden we hear gunfire, and then we hear bullets whizzing over our heads, ding, boom, ding. Boy, it's not the kind of warfare we were accustomed to, and we were petrified. So we dove into a ditch, and meanwhile the firing kept going on, and then fortunately for us, a half-track came along, driven by a Marine who stopped, and he said, "What are you guys doing here? You'll get killed out here." We told him our story. Hop in, he says. So he took us out of that. It was, Guam had been captured and secured, but the Japanese were starving to death, and they're coming out of the hills. Those who weren't captured, coming out of the hills and stealing food, and they'd shoot their way into whatever they had to do in order to get the food. And that was not our cup of tea. I prefer the water to that type of fighting. So then when we got back to our base, and our plane was late the next morning to take us to Ulithi, and I saw for the first time the B-29 Super Fortress. My God, I've never seen it. I built airplanes as a kid. I never saw anything quite like this.
That was the new American bomber.
Yeah, and it was gigantic to me. Now you look at these 747s and C-5As, and it's a pipsqueak, but it was great then.
George, who was Tokyo Rose?
I believe she was an American. She spoke perfect English, and she was a propagandist for the Japanese military. And she was on the radio constantly, one of the first, what do you call them, disc jockeys. And her broadcasts were all beamed to American operations, wherever the bases were, and ships at sea. And I don't know how effective she was as a propagandist, but she had a pretty good surveillance organization, because after the Houston was torpedoed, and I was already ensconced aboard the USS Grayson the following morning, and they used to play Tokyo Rose over their loudspeaker system. And here she was, rosier at her best, telling, I think, the American military, the USS Houston has been hit, it's crippled, and we're going to finish it off.
This was the very next day after the torpedoing.
And that's pretty good intelligence on the part of the Japanese, I would say, because they named the ship.
But yet American naval ships didn't deny this radio program to be played on board ship?
No.
So she'd play music.
Oh, all
popular American
Glenn
tunes.
Miller and the whole bit, yeah.
But intersperse it with propaganda.
Yeah.
And quite often she was accurate.
Yeah.
What effect do you think ultimately it had on the crew?
We laughed. We laughed most of the time, because it was so obvious what she was trying to do that she negated any possibility of succeeding. And by the way, for the last 2 years, we were winning the war. And she was not preaching anything of that sort.
So you knew,
oh, yeah.
the sailors knew that
yeah.
her campaign was misrepresent.
The beauty of her show was she played a lot of American music, which was nice.
And because, I suppose, your distance into the Pacific, you couldn't pick up those radio stations from back home.
No way.
So that's the only way you got.
Yeah, you couldn't even pick up Hawaii.
Right, yeah.
But, well, maybe a 50,000 watt station like WGY or KDKA in Pittsburgh, but maybe at night you could pick those up, but it was not reliable. Yeah.
George, can you describe for us? I understand there's a ritual that takes place at sea when your ship crossed the equator. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think any man who crossed the equator on a naval ship would remember that day. It was more exciting for us than most for this reason. We were being towed across the date line. We had plenty of time. And we had a large number of crewmen.
Excuse me, that's right. You corrected me. It's the international date line.
Yeah.
Correct, not the equator.
Right. We had a large number of crewmen who were shellbacks, which is the term for someone who has gone through the initiation in the past. And those who hadn't were polywogs. And these shellbacks made great arrangements because we didn't have a lot of duties to perform at that time while we were being towed. And I'll describe very briefly. One of the things that I really despise the most, there was a canvas, cylindrical canvas, probably 14 feet or 15 feet long. And they filled that with all the garbage that would fit in there, and then filled it with hot water. And you, as a polywog, part of your initiation was to crawl through this awful, stinking mess and out the other side. But while you're going through, there's people outside with paddles.
So it was similar to like a college hazing almost.
Yes, yes, indeed. And I've heard, it didn't happen on my ship, I heard that sometimes they used to keelhaul somebody. They'd tie a line around their waist, throw them overboard, and pull them out from under and up the other side.
And how did the officers figure into this?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Kevin, because we had an officer aboard ship who was our finance officer. His name was Bill, I can't think of it at the moment. Kirkman or something like that. He was from Houston, Texas, and he was an older man. He probably didn't have to go through the initiation, but he did. And the guys were tough on him. And it's a shame well, he wound up in the sick bay as a result of it.
Really?
Yeah. But it's all over and done with after. Well, one of the things, they sit you in a barber chair. And I had a real head of hair at the time. You lean back and they pour this awful stuff down your throat. Meanwhile, there's a guy with the clippers and he goes right down the center of your scalp. So now you're left with two big clumps of hair, which next day you're in the barber shop getting the rest of it cut off.
So George, what do you think was the purpose just to kind of let off steam, break anxiety? It was long established before you got there.
Oh, long before that, yeah. I guess because of what you have to go through in the initiation just steels you for the time when you have a chance to do this to somebody else. But it's kind of sadistic in some ways because if you didn't like a guy, you could really do a job on him legally.
Right. Okay. George, what was the longest period you were away from home?
It would be from the fall of 43 to May of 45.
How did you manage to keep in touch?
By mail. That was the only way. Because all that time I was at sea. And our mail, I had many people writing to me. I couldn't keep up with the correspondence. But
how'd that make you feel, that people reached out and sent you letters?
Good, but you were aware of the fact that everything was rosy back home all the time. They never told you their troubles, and they couldn't. Even if you wanted to tell them your problems, you couldn't do it because we were highly censored.
Now explain that for us, if you will.
Well, if I sent you a letter at that time, it would go through a censor aboard my ship.
So there was an individual assigned to read each article of mail?
Many individuals, all officers, and anything even hinting of our whereabouts or our objective, cut out. Either crossed out so that you couldn't read it or sliced out with a razor blade. People at home would get a letter with just all blanks. if you weren't smart enough to avoid it.
And the concern was that someone back home, if they had an idea where you'd be, might say it in casual conversation.
Oh, sure. You know.
And was there really that much of a concern that information would filter back to the enemy?
It wasn't so
from
far as
thousands of miles away.
I think that was brought about primarily because of the war in the Atlantic, and where they had the submarine scare with the Nazis. But they were very, very strict on that. But we bypassed it one time. I'll tell you about it when I get aboard the English ship. I had a code with my immediate family, and they always had an idea what theater of operation I was working in. But of course, they had to keep it to themselves. But it helped them. These are all funny names in the Pacific: Funafudi, Kula Gulf, and stuff like that. Kola Bangara. So, but at least from the reports they get from the Associated Press or the newspapers, they could get an idea. Well, George is here now, and kind of follow you around a little bit. But no, you can understand the reason for the censoring, particularly in the Atlantic Ocean, where they had to protect all those supply ships that were going.
Well, I've read where there was a slogan: "Loose lips sink ships."
Sink ships, that's true.
That was often repeated.
Mm-hmm.
George, at one point, you just referenced that you were on an English ship. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, when we got to Manus Island.
And Manus Island was a repair facility?
Well, yes. Well, I don't know about the island itself, but there was a repair facility there in the form of a floating dry dock. And this is a gigantic floating dry dock. In fact, I should tell you, the Manus Island is in the Admiralties, in English possession. When we got to Manus Island, there really wasn't an awful lot of work for us other than creating work, chipping and painting and what have you. So there wasn't too much communication work being done.
Did you live on board ship while it was in dry dock, or did you live on land in barracks?
Oh, on board ship.
So while the repairs continued in the floating dry dock, you stayed on board ship, and they had you doing labor.
Manual, menial. But if you like sleeping with riveting guns going off and what have you, that's what we had. Well, as I say, there wasn't too much communication. There weren't too many communication possibilities. So these good radio men, the three of us who were called from Pearl Harbor back to the ship, now were assigned to an English ship, the HMS Swiftshore. It was temporary duty because there wasn't too much for us to do in the dry dock. And our purpose in being, the reason why they assigned us to this HMS Swiftshore was to do the best we could to teach them high-speed communications based upon the Morse code. Now, we at the time in our Navy, we were copying Radio Honolulu primarily, and we were doing coded groups at about approximately 35 words a minute. Well, 35 words a minute means you have to be able to type at least 35 words a minute, and we could do much better than that. But the three of us that were brought back to the ship were assigned to the Swiftshore, and we went aboard, and it was an experience. It was the newest English capital ship afloat. and it was a cruiser, and comprised of a crew such as all large ships in the English Navy were: Irish, English, Welsh, Scotch, and what have you.
And how did they treat you?
They treated us royally. I couldn't have been treated better. They were the most hospitable people. We were careful. If you, at that time there was quite a bit of friction between the English and the Irish, and you had to be very careful how you mesh gears with the various cliques. But for the most part, they were absolutely great, and they had some pretty good rules too.
Such as?
Every morning they'd up spirits, and that meant you would get your rum, which was, for the enlisted men, it was mixed with water and called grog. But for the officers, and they treated us as officers, we drank our rum straight, and it was 110 proof rum. There was no air conditioning. It's 100 degrees in the shade, and 110 proof rum. After that, you're ready to take a nap. But it was a great thing. It kind of introduced us to better drinking habits. And then in the afternoon, they'd pipe up spirit, or up, what was it? I've forgotten the name they had for this, but they served you tea and crumpets, which was nice. And I, for the benefit of the audience listening to this, if you ever wondered why they called the English sailors limeys, they had a big barrel, and there must have been about the twice of the steel barrels we're familiar with. Oil
55-gallon drum, yeah, okay, bigger than that.
And this was made of wood and wired around and so forth, and that was full of lime juice, or some concoction with lime juice in it. And that was to prevent scurvy, which dates way back to the
Which is a vitamin C deficiency.
Yes, yeah. And there was a big
ladle,
I guess. Yeah, you dip it in, and everybody dipped in and drank. Never washed the cup or anything. I didn't participate in that. But that was pretty popular aboard the ship.
So these were rituals that were far different from the United States Navy.
Yeah. Well, everything is tradition, both English and American. Yeah.
But your treatment was good. How effective, or how were you able to mesh with them as far as your radio training and what they were looking to learn with the high-speed communication?
We did not do well, and the reason being that to copy coded groups at a high speed, you had to be a pretty fair typist. And they only had 2 typewriters aboard, and they were standard typewriters, not communication typewriters. One belonged to the captain, and one belonged to the executive officer. So they loaned us their typewriters, but it didn't work out too well. Besides, their people couldn't type. So the 2 systems just didn't mesh properly. No. And the English at the time were still copying pencil and paper, radio Belconnen and what have you, at 12, 14 words a minute.
Did you feel our system was better?
Oh, by far. There's no question about it.
Because the English Navy, of course, had a great history, a rich history, and good reputation.
Yes, but they pretty much vacated the Pacific because they had big problems in the Atlantic. And what they had, they used.
They put their resources there rather than.
And now they had everything under control in the Atlantic, and they were working their way back into the Pacific.
I see. George, in your line of work on board ship in communications, did you ever have the opportunity to interface with high-ranking commanders? Would you get communications from other ships of the line where you might be talking with an admiral or someone?
It did happen occasionally, but it was strictly happenstance, where I guess the admiral or whoever the high-ranking officer was, he didn't want to take the time to do this through a radio man and blah, 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 and he would grab the mic and during a combat situation. And he needed action immediately.
And did that ever happen while you were on duty?
One time, when we were making the raids on Clark and Nichols Field in the Philippines, the fellows, the pilots were having a field day over the target, and they stayed and stayed and stayed and used every bit of ammunition and bombs and what have you they had, but they outran their fuel. And at that time, I think it was Bull Halsey, he ordered, well, it became dark, he ordered all the carriers to turn on their lights, and he instructed them to take aboard any airplane. It didn't have to be their own carrier, just as long as they get there, because they were running out of fuel.
I see, yeah.
And it was important to him to save the pilots, as well as the planes, if possible. So there were a few words spoken there.
And of course, to turn lights on at sea in a combat area was tremendously risky.
It's the only time I've ever seen it during wartime.
I mean, wouldn't you be reprimanded for lighting a cigarette out of doors on deck?
You'd be court-martialed.
So this was highly unusual.
Yeah, it sure was. And I remember what excited, I think it was Halsey, when the lights went on these carriers. There was one carrier there. It was a brand new carrier, first-class carrier too, and her deck was full of airplanes. And Halsey had a way of speaking. I can't quote verbatim because it's not the kind of language you use over TV, but boy, he pulled that captain out on that ship.
To make room for the incoming planes.
Dumped them. Yeah,
to dump, in other words, clear them from the deck so the other planes coming in the dark could land.
Yeah.
And you heard those communications.
Yeah.
George, what was Christmas like at sea? You were there from 43 to 44, that particular year. What was December of 43 like for you to be away from home and be on board a ship that had been injured?
Well, I'll quote you better about December 44, because that's memorable in my mind.
Okay.
We had a bugler aboard ship. He was a quartermaster by the name of Roback. He had played with some pretty good bands prior to going into the service. And Christmas Eve of 1944, we were at Manus Island, and everybody's homesick, particularly at Christmas time. Roback got on the loudspeaker at midnight and played "I'll Be Home for Christmas." Brought tears to everybody's eyes. They wanted to kill him afterwards.
That was a popular song by Bing Crosby at the time?
That's correct. And he did a masterful job playing that night.
But it lowered morale, was the ultimate. He thought he was doing something nice, and it had a bad effect.
Yep. I happened to run into him a few years back over in New England at a meeting of the Houston survivors, and I mentioned it to him. He remembered it very well. He said, I got a lot of flack on that one.
George, you just touched on something I'd like to let our audience know. Did you manage to keep in touch with shipmates after the war?
Yes.
And you mentioned a reunion.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us more about those things?
Yes. The reunion started, some 25, 30 years ago. And they would pick a city and assign someone to that city to be the host or hostess, whatever. Their wives would be the hostess. And we had cities like Norfolk, Virginia, San Diego, Cleveland, Buffalo. Buffalo was a great place for the reunion too, because Buffalo has a great naval display on at Lake Erie. They have a cruiser. They got a destroyer. Well, they have the Sullivans, which was named after the 5 boys who were killed on the Juno. And it's a good display. It's worth your while if you're ever in the Buffalo area. I mean, all these, Boston, all the best cities, and they were well-attended meetings. Now we're dying off so fast that the meetings aren't too well attended, and if they are, there are people coming with walkers and canes and what have you. But yeah, we still have those. They had one just recently in New Hampshire, which I didn't get to attend, but I expect to go to the next one.
And how did that make you feel when you attended those?
Good. They were lacking something, though, I'll tell you.
How so?
We had no officers join it.
Now, what do you attribute that to?
I don't know. I have an idea, but it's
Even
pure-
even in the early reunions when,
Well, we sometimes. One time we had an admiral who was commandant of the Japanese sea frontier prior to his retirement, and he had been our first lieutenant aboard the USS Houston as a lieutenant commander. He was in charge of all maintenance and repairs. And here he is, a retired admiral. He came to a meeting one day, or a couple of days he spent there, he and his wife, and it was a delightful meeting. I thoroughly enjoyed the man's company. And but there were very few officers involved with the program.
when during the war, an onboard ship, was there a real class distinction between officers and enlisted?
Extremely prominent. The officers ate in different area. They had a wardroom, dining room, what have you, and they had their own staterooms and what have you. And that's not to say that there was a problem between the men and the officers. We had good officers, for the most part, which is like everything, you know. Sometimes you get a good boss, sometimes you get a bad one. But we had, for the most part, good officers. And
Do you think that difference served a purpose at that time?
well, the Navy's the Navy, and it's kind of hard to describe, but
It has its ways.
it sure does, and they stick by them too. You know. We were able to mesh gears with and get along with Annapolis officers better than we could 90-day wonders or what have you.
What was a 90-day wonder?
Well, they sent you to school for 90 days and made you an ensign.
Well, that was a
commission.
sarcastic term.
Yeah. But an Annapolis officer, you always knew what they were going to do and what they were going to say, because it would be exactly according to the Blue Jacket Manual, right according to the script of the Navy. You know.
Who was the captain of the Houston?
Bill Behrens, we used to call him Wild Bill Behrens. As you know, the people of Houston, Texas, bought or paid for the USS Houston.
Through war bonds and fundraising?
Yeah, they had a big fundraising deal in Houston for it. And consequently, at every opportunity, we would fly this gigantic Lone Star flag of Texas. And if you were, let me explain, let me preclude this. When you were in the Pacific, the only port we ever hit on the Houston was Pearl Harbor. The rest, you'd go into an anchorage, which is a wide place surrounded by islands and deep enough to take a fleet in and at anchor and get your supplies and what have you, and never a pier to pull into or a port to go to. So I lost my train of thought there.
We were talking about the Lone Star flag.
Oh, yeah, whenever we go through a anchorage, our captain, he used to like go fast. And he would raise that Lone Star flag and go through the whole fleet. And it brought on a lot of comments, a lot of signalmen from the signal bridge and so on and so forth. And he just reveled in that. He enjoyed that.
He wanted Texas to be remembered.
The eyes of Texas are upon you.
Now, did you notice amongst the crew, was the crew very distributed, you know, from different regions, you being from the Northeast, but the ship having been the hull laid down, well, financed by the people of Houston, Texas, let's say.
And the hull was laid down in
And I'm
Portsmouth.
sure it had a good proportion of Texans on it?
I don't know. We had, Kirkland was the name of that finance officer.
Okay.
Correct that.
Okay.
We had quite a few Texans on there, but it wasn't predominant or anything.
Were there any, did you notice any, amongst the crew, were there any rivalries or cliques that from people being from different regions of the United States, either the Southwest or Southeast or Northeast? Or
Not that I was aware of.
so it was pretty harmonious.
Yeah. Of course, we did have segregation at that time. that segregation didn't end until the Truman administration, well after the war, I think around 47 or 8, something like that.
So between white and black sailors?
Well, mess cooks and stewards, and they were either Filipino or black. All pretty good guys, and we got along fine with them,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
You know. But they served well, and they did a good job for us. And I didn't know of any racial problems on our ship or anything like that. We were all in the same boat, so to speak. But other than that, that's the only distinction there were between the enlisted people. Yeah.
George, when you weren't in combat, but yet you were at sea, what did you have for entertainment?
At sea, we had no entertainment. You couldn't have movies while you were en route. But whenever we were at an atoll at anchor, we had movies every night. And we had people running back and forth all day long with small boats, trading this movie for that movie. And,
Between ships?
yeah. And
Now, where would they show the movies?
aft on the Houston. You've seen pictures of the Houston. The after, the 6-inch, which our main battery, they'd hang a screen there and project towards the front of the ship. And meantime, you'd have your theater of chairs all back towards the hangar deck. You've seen that was blowing up there. And that it was a nice deal. We had good.
Do you remember any of the movies?
Well, we used to get a kick out of John Wayne, who never served a day in the service, and he was a hero in every movie.
So they would show the films, the war films that he
Oh,
would make?
yeah, yeah.
How'd that make you feel?
Well, hey,
Just, it was a laugh.
Yeah, we. One I appreciated more than any is the movie. I think it was entitled Midway, but I'm not sure what the title. But it was about the Japanese attempt to take over Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea. Yeah. But no, for the most part, we enjoyed the movies, and we used to really scream when some lone Japanese, we used to call him a washing machine Charlie, he'd come flying over at night, and that'd end the movies, and we'd all go to GQ, and this guy'd go on his merry way, but he screwed up our night pretty good.
Oh, in other words, a plane would come into range, and
Yeah.
you'd have to go to general
Oh, sure.
quarters, and it'd
Yeah.
interrupt the movie.
Right. The movie does produce some light, but not very much. Yeah.
How about physical exercise while on board ship? Did
Every morning at, I've forgotten the term for it, we would muster every morning, all people aboard ship except those on watch would have to muster, and it wasn't reveille, but it was after reveille, and you would do calisthenics at that time. And we had an officer by the name of Reinhardt. We nicknamed him Jumpin' Jack Reinhardt. He went through all the motions, and this is what we'd have to do, up and down, so on and so forth. It was good for the crew. He was a good officer too. Yeah.
George, after the war ended, where did you go, and what line of work did you pursue?
I was discharged. I was still aboard the Houston when my papers came through. They sent me to a separation center in Long Island. I think it was Lido Beach.
And let's clarify that for people. Did you make the trip back through the Panama Canal?
Oh, sure, yeah.
But at that point, the war was over?
Oh,
that
yeah.
must have been
Yeah.
somewhat of a more leisurely cruise?
Yeah. Oh, well, yes, at that point it was. But, when the Houston finished its repairs in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, it was like launching a new ship. We had to go on a shakedown cruise, and that was not leisurely. And we were shorthanded because married men were all discharged if they qualified. And as radio men, we were all qualified, and in combat record, we were all qualified.
And when you say qualified,
to be discharged.
you earned enough points?
Yeah, it was a point program. And we more than had enough points as radio men, but radio men were scarce and they wouldn't let us go. So at any rate, we served longer than we had to. But we had the shakedown cruise, and we spent a month or two down in Cuba in the winter of '45 in Guantanamo Bay. And then Oh, and just prior to that, we were in Guantanamo when the first Navy Day was celebrated. It was in October of 45. And we, being the USS Houston, bought and paid for by the people of Houston, Texas, for Navy Day, we were assigned to go to Houston, Texas from Guantanamo, which isn't a very great distance, just across the Gulf. And we had more journalists and writers and congressmen and senators aboard that ship. They all flew to Guantanamo in order to make the trip back to Houston, on the Houston. So for the first time, we got a little experience about sending messages. There was no more radio silence, you know. It was a good experience. We got to Galveston, Texas, and started up the channel towards Houston. I think it was about 45 or 50 miles from Galveston north. And we had pilots come aboard to do that. And part of the trip we had to be towed. It was the channel was so narrow that we could reach out and touch the people on the shore as we moved along. We moved by the San Jacinto battlefield, I remember that. And we went into Houston, Texas, and we were there for 10 or 12 days. And the mayor came aboard as soon as we arrived, and he announced to all of us, he said, I was elected on a platform of law and order, so I can't prevent you from getting arrested, but I can get you out if you are.
So that was his way of showing gratitude.
Yeah, and hospitality. And they opened up all the breweries in I don't know how many there were.
Texas was happy they had their ship back. Yeah. After what it had been through, it had been torpedoed, nearly sunk.
Yep.
Actually used as bait, I understand, at one point.
I happened to be a member of that club, the Streamlined Bait Club, the most exclusive club in the Pacific Theater.
Can you tell us about that?
Briefly, when Halsey, we were being towed, along with the Canberra, I guess. Halsey was using as bait for the Japanese fleet to come out so he could wipe them out. Fortunately, the Japanese, for me, fortunately, they recognized what was going on in time, and they withdrew. But we were known as the bait.
Because the ship was crippled and under tow.
Yeah, and Halsey was certain they were going to come out to finish us off.
But luckily that didn't materialize.
No.
Yeah.
But Halsey did, he personally founded the Streamlined Bait Club, and we all got certificates of being members of the Streamlined Bait Club, which was a very exclusive organization.
Well, up until the point where the Houston was torpedoed and actually towed and ultimately salvaged, the U.S. Navy's policy had been to scuttle ships in that condition, was it not?
Yeah.
So this was a rare thing.
Yeah.
So the ship was returned to service, but at that point the war ended.
Yeah.
And the ship was
the war
remained.
Ended. We were in the Brooklyn Navy Yard being repaired when the war ended. Was it sometime around July of 45 or something like that?
Did you anticipate where were you when you heard that the atom bomb had been used?
In Brooklyn. We left the ship in Brooklyn and lived in a barracks on Flatbush Avenue.
How did you receive that?
Avenue.
How did you receive that news?
Oh, we were delighted. Yeah. We're going home. But even then, the Russians were acting up. And we had a powwow one night, and we enlisted men primarily and one officer. We said, as much as we want to go home, let's finish it now.
Really?
Yeah, but there was no chance of doing that because our State Department was so loaded with pinks and communists that you just didn't oppose Stalin. Now I'm getting into politics, and I shouldn't do that here.
That's all right. Now the war's ended. Where did you discharge from?
Lido Beach on Long Island.
Take a train home?
Yeah, we took a bus into New York City and took the went to Grand Central Station and went New York Central to Albany. And
was anybody there waiting for you?
At Albany?
Yeah.
No, I didn't notify anyone that I was going to come.
Why did you do that?
Well, because I had been seeing them fairly regularly while my ship was in Brooklyn.
I see.
If we'd get the weekend off, sometimes we did. It's only 2.5 hours to Albany. So I got to see all my people all the while. Yeah. So there was no need in making a big deal out of coming home.
What time did you get home for good?
I believe it was in the afternoon. I remember I had my sea bag and all that.
Still in uniform?
Yeah, oh yeah, with my ruptured duck, which is a insignia stating that you were discharged and so forth. And
It really was an eagle.
is that what it was?
I think that's what and
Yeah,
they
could be.
as
It was yellow, I remember that.
American servicemen
Yeah.
turned it into a.
So I had to go. I had to walk from the depot in Broadway, on Broadway, up Columbia Street, I guess it was, to Pearl Street, get a Beltline trolley, which went up Clinton Avenue. And that was my homecoming. And I couldn't wait to get rid of the sea bag and all the other paraphernalia, which was my entire wardrobe at one point.
Good to be home.
Yep, you bet.
And how did life go for you after the war, George? What line of work did you want? You went back to the food
I went back in the food
company that you'd worked for prior to the war?
Yep, and they welcomed me, but they had no need for me. They, 'cause all these other fellows had gotten out before me. I was frozen in because of a radio shortage. So they asked me to take some time off, and I said, I don't want to take any time off. I want to go to work. And I guess I had been a good enough worker in the past with them that they figured, well, we better put in the work, even though we don't need them. And I told them I didn't want to work in a freezer anymore. So they gave me an office job with the possibility of going on the road as a salesman, which I did about a year later. And things started blossoming for me at that. I guess I kind of was geared toward selling and merchandising, and with my warehouse experience and everything, I had a whole lot going for me, calling on these customers who had been neglected totally during the war.
Because of shortages?
Oh yeah, yeah, and it wasn't a question of selling something during the war, it's a question of having something to sell. So, but they had situations like, at that time, Birdseye controlled 97% of the retail frozen food business in America. Think about that. That's a tremendous figure.
Pretty good market share.
Yeah. And how they had some competitors like Honor Brand, Pick Sweet, Seabrook, Courtly, Dulaney, and a number of them, but they were all minuscule compared to Birdseye. And yet Birdseye wasn't making a profit. However, during the war, these distributors, such as the one I worked for, their problem was getting product. And they developed programs whereby, well, if you want a case of peas or you want a case of strawberries, you have to buy 2 cases of succotash, which didn't sell very fast.
Which wasn't a good seller.
So here you are, a salesman, you come out into the field, and oh boy, am I waiting for you. My freezer's full of succotash. And well, that was all part
But
of
it was a good career?
Yeah, oh indeed. I blossomed pretty well there, and I became, well, a couple of transfers, and one transfer got me an award, a national award for selling the most frying chickens, Birdseye frying chickens. And I had to make a speech one day on how I succeeded in making this achievement. And when I finished talking, I sat down and I could not remember what I said. I was totally at a loss. And I was fine one-on-one with a customer, but with a whole group of people.
A little bit nervous.
Indeed I was. So the first thing I did, well, let me tell you this, you might find this interesting. Shortly after that, I got promoted. They made me sales manager of the Seneca Frosted Foods in Rochester, New York. And I knew my shortcomings in facing a group for speaking. So I joined the Dale Carnegie course in public speaking. And that went over very, very well. I enjoyed it thoroughly. In fact, I wound up a student instructor in Dale Carnegie. And that was a great propellant for me in my sales work.
Of course, Dale Carnegie wrote the famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
And incidentally, that's a wonderful book for young people today. That is a good book. And
But that course helped you get over that difficult.
Immeasurably. Yep, immeasurably. And from there, I was brought back to Albany as a sales manager, which is the main office. I persevered there for a couple of years, and then I decided I wanted to go in business myself. And I bought out an old-time candy broker by the name of Ransford, and established my brokerage business in this area. And I had offices here and in Syracuse. And we grew and prospered to the point where we were doing $25–30 million a year, and pretty good size. Well, in fact, we were, if not the largest, one of the two largest brokerage firms in the state. And we did very, very well. The Lord is good. Yeah.
George, do you think how would you say your service in the United States Navy helped prepare you? Did that figure into any of your things that you did later in life?
Immeasurably. I was the most undisciplined person you could put into uniform when I went into service. And I learned rapidly, you have to be disciplined or you don't get along at all. And that was a great, great boost for me in my career and my life. But the regulation and what have you, which you resisted and disliked, you can see where it's good. In fact, I often said, I wish every young man could get at least 1 year service in the regulation and the discipline that's involved in it. It would better them tremendously in the rest of their lives. Yeah.
You had mentioned at one time you tied up next to the Indianapolis.
Yes.
Is there a story there? Did you get on board? Did you know people from the Indianapolis?
Well, the Indianapolis was an old cruiser, beautiful lines, and she tied up to us. I think they called that rafting in those days. And the Indianapolis had a Catholic chaplain, and the Houston had a Protestant chaplain. So on Sundays, the Catholics would go aboard the Indianapolis for services, and the Protestants would come aboard the Houston for services. And that got to be a very nice program. I think it only happened once or twice, but it did give a nice relationship between the two crews. And we had certain officers on our ship and on the Indianapolis who were Annapolis graduates, and they were friendly, and it was just a nice arrangement. And we just walked back and forth between the two ships all the while with no restrictions or anything whatsoever. So it was a great, great relationship between the two crews, and it was a real blow to all of us on the Houston when the Indianapolis went down some months later, carrying the atom bomb. Well, they had already delivered parts of the atom bomb to, I think it was Cinney or Rota, one of those islands. And what they were doing where they were, I know not, but they were running unescorted when they were hit. It was a real fluke. In fact, if I recall correctly, the captain of the Indianapolis, his name was McVeigh, I think. And he was court-martialed and exonerated after his death. It was one of those fluke deals that happened around midnight. And it was, the Indianapolis, I said, was an old ship. It didn't have the compartmentalization that the new ships did. And this Japanese sub-commander who testified imagine that, they had a Japanese sub-commander testify at the court-martial of a naval captain. And he more or less attributed or contributed information that eventually wound up exonerating the captain from responsibility for that sinking, because none of our compartment doors or hatches were closed, and the torpedo
water flooded the ship quickly.
Yeah, the torpedo hit a strategic spot, and it flooded so rapidly that they were in the water a long time. Those fellows that survived that are mighty, mighty fortunate. But they're all dying off now too. They're older men.
Mm-hmm. George, looking through your paperwork that you brought with you this morning, I noticed a certificate. It looked like you sang in the ship's choir.
That was.
Is that accurate?
That was in boot camp. Yes,
Oh, was it
that is correct. And we had a great choir. We sang over the radio in Syracuse.
Had you sung in a choir as a young boy in your parish?
Well, I always sang. In fact, you might be interested in this. I had a friend in later life who was the lead singer for the Horace Heidt Orchestra. And of course, he was retired from that. He was much older than me. He was a member of Wolfert's Roof's Country Club, a fellow named Bud Fleming. And he was always remarking, he said, "George loves to sing. Isn't it a shame he can't?" And he had a voice that was capable of getting away with that because no one could sing as well as he could. But I love to sing. And yeah, it was a good choir, strictly a men's choir, Navy. And we sing masses and services for the Protestants, what have you, all around the Sampson Naval Base area. Yeah. Well, there were several reasons why I agreed to do this, Kevin. I think you find most World War II combat people keep their stories pretty much to themselves. But now the combat veterans of World War II are dying off rapidly. And I admired the way you conducted the interview with Colonel Brokaw, who was a good friend of mine.
Gentlemen, thank you.
And Jerry Wenger. You did a great job there. And I said, here's an opportunity for me to say for our current generation what things were like in World War II, to some degree anyway. And secondly, I wanted to cover the fact that people who only know you as Kevin Morgan should know that you're the guy who runs and controls the operation of the of the crossings park in Colonie, which is used by many thousands of people and people who just rave about the park. And I hope everybody knows who's responsible for the running of that park.
Well, that's nice of you to say, George. Thanks. And that's where our relationship really started.
Yes, it is.
That's where we first met.
Yep. And I'm very happy for that.
I am too. I'm a richer man from it. And I know, really, we talked about this many times in the past, and you were always, reluctant might not be the right word, but I know it took a lot for you to come here today to discuss this.
I'm very happy to have done it.
And it's fascinating, and I know there's even a lot more to the story of George Cinney's career.
Well, we'll cover it sometime.
Yep, perhaps we can in another issue, but I think we've got a lot in today. I'd like to, I'm sorry, if you want to add something in, go right ahead.
There's one more thing I
Sure.
would like to relate to the listening audience, especially the young people of college age, and even younger. When you read your history books, be sure to remember that you're reading what someone else is thinking. And sometimes the author doesn't cover things as they actually were. It may be for a number of reasons. But I've agreed to this, and for other things similar to this, because I have a first-hand knowledge of what was taking place. And I offer for your edification the following. We had an opportunity after World War II to do much more than we did with the world and with peace. We made grave mistakes in our victory. We did a wonderful job of getting the victory. And we had cooperation from all avenues of mankind. But after the war, when we made political mistakes and we gave Stalin practically all of Eastern Europe and Poland, and what a tragic mistake that was. It created our problem with the Cold War. Here we were, the only nation in the world with the atom bomb, the most powerful nation in the world. We survived World War II in great shape. The greatest Navy, the greatest Army, the greatest Marine Corps, you name it. Even the greatest Merchant Marine. And we kowtowed to despot like Stalin, who in turn brought on the problem with Chinese communism. How? Well, our politicians gave Stalin everything he needed, and he in turn was passing things on to Mao Zedong in China. I'm talking about armaments and any other supplies. We had a Chinaman by the name of Chiang Kai-shek who was fighting the communists in China. We made a decision to pull all our armaments away from him and give them to Mao Zedong, which also gave us Korea. And we had a miserable treaty with Korea, North Korea, and you see what we're going through with them these days, which pretty much brought on Vietnam. But let me get back to Korea. We had a General MacArthur who was a brilliant tactician, strategist, who firmly believed in protecting his troops. And when the Chinese communists were coming down over the Yellow River and bombing his troops, he went over the Yellow River and bombed the Chinese. But he was restricted by politicians. He was forbidden not to do it, and he did it anyway. And he was relieved of his duties. Now you can face Vietnam. And I want to tell you a little something about that one too before I sign off here. We had victory in our hands in Vietnam and blew the whole thing. We actually had won that great last battle in Vietnam, and we wind up turning it over to the communists. So pay attention to your history teachers and your history books, but find out where their information comes from. If it's from research, you better hope it's legitimate research. And if it's personal opinion, think deeply. We are a great nation, and we can be even greater, but we've got to pull together and do it. We can't do it fighting bad causes. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, George, for being here today. And I think that's really what a lot of this program's about, is for current and future generations to look back. I mean, these events were not that long ago. Yeah. And of course, the old saying that history can repeat itself, we all look to learn. That's the challenge to each new generation. Yeah. Not to be so cavalier about it, but to study things and try to do better. And I hope we can. You were called at a time when the world really went into some very difficult times. And your entire generation rose to that occasion and came through it very well. And we really appreciate you coming here today and discussing your experience, what you saw firsthand. 64 years ago today, your ship was torpedoed. And we're awfully glad that God had other ideas for George Cinney.
The Lord is good.
Yes, and I know I enjoy your relationship, and I hope people have a chance to learn from this, and it spurs some more opportunities for people to look into the sinking of the Houston and what happened in that portion of the war at that time. This was George Cinney's war, and he shared his story with us today, and I want to thank him for it. So thank you very much, George.
Thank you. And one last thing. I'm glad you gave me this opportunity to tell everyone how I brought Tojo, Hitler, and Mussolini to their knees.
Almost single-handedly. God bless you. Thanks, George. Very good. Well, if anyone is enjoyed this program and is interested in participating in either of the town's veteran projects, one being on our website, which is at www.colonie.org. That's a pictorial history that has over 800 town residents already listed on it. There's a photograph and there's a short biography. It's great research. I encourage people to take a look at it. And also, if you have a veteran in the family that you'd like to encourage to participate in our oral history project, which this was an example of today, you can contact me personally at 438-5587. So thanks very much for joining us today, and thank you again, George.
Thank you.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.